Hey, Indian Creek 8th grade students, it's Professor Blazek, and I'm here today with part 3 of our video series on the Civil Rights era, looking at presidential actions during this time period. Now, the guiding question that I would like you to keep in mind as you watch this video is, what role did Presidents Kennedy and Johnson play in the fight for civil rights? Now, the presidential election of 1960 would see Republican Vice President Richard Nixon face off against the Democratic Senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy. Kennedy being pictured at the top, Nixon being pictured there at the bottom. Now, Nixon would lead in the polls for much of the campaign until the first ever televised presidential debate would prove to be a turning point. Kennedy appeared youthful and confident on television screens across the country during the debate, while Nixon, who was recovering from an illness, appeared tired and sickly by comparison. Now, in a study done afterwards, those who watched the debate felt that Kennedy was the clear winner, while those who only listened would actually feel that Nixon made the better points overall. Regardless, this debate would create a huge amount of momentum for Kennedy, who would go on to win with 303 electoral votes to Nixon's 219. Now, this major divide in the Electoral College was in spite of the fact that Kennedy only won 0.2% more of the overall popular vote in one of the closest presidential races in history. Now, upon taking office, President Kennedy proposed a group of plans that he called the New Frontier, which proclaimed a vision for America moving into the future. One area of concern within the New Frontier was civil rights. President Kennedy wanted to help African Americans in their quest for equality, but he also didn't want to anger Southern Democrats by moving too quickly. Kennedy knew that he would need these legislators' support in any laws he would propose, so he acted very cautiously. However, President Kennedy would ask Congress for a bill that guaranteed civil rights in 1963. This bill would pass the House of Representatives, but would then go on to stall in the Senate. Now, during President Kennedy's time in office, the integration of American universities would come into focus. In 1962, a federal court would order the University of Mississippi to enroll its first African American student, James Meredith, who is pictured there at the right. However, Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett would prevent Meredith from registering at the university multiple times. President Kennedy would send federal marshals to escort Meredith to campus, which would go on to spark riots across the area. Meredith would ultimately register and eventually graduate from Ole Miss, but 2 people would be killed in these campus riots. Now, another example of campus violence would occur the following year when Alabama Governor George Wallace promised that he would not allow the University of Alabama to integrate. President Kennedy would act once more, sending the National Guard in to make sure African American students could enter the school, and this would force Governor Wallace to back down. Following this entire ordeal, President Kennedy would then address the nation on June 11th, citing the new major civil rights legislation that we had discussed earlier, which would make major strides toward racial equality. Now, unfortunately, before President Kennedy's civil rights bill could pass the Senate, he was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. Kennedy had taken a campaign trip to Dallas, Texas, and during a ride around the city in an open car, President Kennedy was shot and killed. The nation was stunned at the loss of the president, who had been a beacon of hope and a living embodiment of America's entry into the future. Ex-Marine Lee Harvey Oswald, who is pictured there at the top, was arrested the same day and charged with killing President Kennedy. 2 days later, when Oswald was being moved from one jail to another, Dallas club owner Jack Ruby would push through the crowd of surrounding policemen and shoot and kill Oswald. A government commission would later find that Oswald had acted alone in killing President Kennedy. But this moment has led to much speculation of a larger conspiracy involving the president's death. Now, in the wake of President Kennedy's death, Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson would take office as the new president of the United States. Johnson would announce a list of proposals that outlined a great vision for America called the Great Society. Johnson's views were even more ambitious than Kennedy's and included a number of ways to help Americans who were living below the poverty line. Johnson established Medicare, which helped senior citizens afford health care, and Medicaid, which helped the poor pay for health care. Both of these entities are still involved in America today, and they were two major moments in the early days of President Johnson's term in office. Now, President Johnson also promised to turn former President Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill into law, and Congress would pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 the following July. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 would prohibit discrimination against African Americans in voting, in employment, and in public facilities. It would also ban discrimination based upon gender, religion, or culture, and it was a major bill in the fight for equality amongst all people. Now, this bill was a revolutionary moment in the fight for equal rights, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would call the act nothing less than a second emancipation, obviously calling back to President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation nearly 100 years prior. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 would also help pave the way for two additional laws to follow. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 would prohibit literacy tests and other discriminatory voting laws that had been in place to try and prevent African Americans from either registering or actually taking part in the act of voting, while the Fair Housing Act of 1968 would prohibit discrimination in the sale, rental, or financing of property. So we will end our video with a return to our guiding question: what role did Presidents Kennedy and Johnson play in the fight for civil rights? In our next video, we will continue to examine the progression of the civil rights movement in America. Until then, this has been Professor Blazek, signing off.